Los Angeles, 1947, a city of glamour, ambition, and dark secrets. Among them, one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. This is the story of the Black Dahlia. January 15th, 1947. A cold morning in Los Angeles. Betty Bersinger, a local housewife, walks with her young daughter along Norton Avenue, a quiet street in the Limert Park neighborhood. She notices something unusual in an empty lot ahead, a pale figure lying on the ground. At first, she thinks it's a discarded mannequin, until she gets closer. Then, horror sets in. The body of a young woman lies in the grass, severed in half at the waist. Her arms are positioned above her head as if staged. Her mouth is carved into a grotesque smile. The woman's lifeless eyes stare blankly at the sky. Betty runs to a nearby house and frantically calls the police. Within minutes, detectives swarm the scene, struggling to comprehend the brutality before them. Who was she? Who could have done something so monstrous? This was the beginning of one of the most infamous murder cases in American history, a case that, to this day, remains unsolved. The victim was soon identified as Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress. But in death, she would become known by a far more infamous name, the Black Dahlia. Born on July 29, 1924, in Boston, Elizabeth grew up dreaming of fame. She was the daughter of Cleo and Phoebe Short, but her childhood was marked by tragedy. In 1930, her father disappeared, leaving the family to struggle. For years, they believed he had died, until he was discovered alive in California, having abandoned them. As a teenager, Elizabeth was known for her striking beauty, pale skin, jet black hair, deep blue eyes. She loved the glamour of Hollywood, and often dressed in dark, elegant clothing, one possible inspiration for the nickname she would later be given. In 1943, she moved to California, hoping for a fresh start. She worked as a waitress and spent time in the lively jazz clubs of Hollywood. But behind the smiles and the glamorous photographs, she was struggling, bouncing between cities, often relying on the kindness of acquaintances and short-lived romances. She had no steady job, no real home. She was often seen with servicemen and Hollywood hopefuls, but none of them could have predicted the horrific fate that awaited her. Elizabeth Short's life was full of mystery, but her death? That would become one of the greatest mysteries of all. The discovery of Elizabeth Short's mutilated body sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. Within hours, the case became front-page news. Who could have committed such a gruesome crime, and why? The LAPD immediately launched an investigation. Lead detectives Harry Hansen and Finnis Brown examined the crime scene, stunned by the precision of the mutilation. The body had been completely drained of blood, leaving the pale skin almost doll-like. There was no sign of struggle, no blood at the scene. It was clear Elizabeth had been killed elsewhere and deliberately placed here. Her face had been cut from ear to ear in a twisted Glasgow smile, her body posed in a disturbing, theatrical fashion. The cause of death? Massive blood loss from deep lacerations on her face and head. The medical examiner also noted ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, suggesting she had been tied up and tortured for hours before her death. As the news spread, witnesses began coming forward. Some claimed they had seen Elizabeth alive just days before. The last confirmed sighting was on January 9, 1947, when she was seen at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA. She had reportedly been waiting for someone, but no one knows who. Then, the case took a shocking turn. On January 21, 1947, just days after her body was found, the Los Angeles Examiner received an anonymous letter. Inside was a chilling ransom-style note made from cut-out letters that read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." Along with the note were some of Elizabeth's personal items, her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book with missing pages. The sender had soaked everything in gasoline, likely to remove fingerprints. The press dubbed the killer the Black Dahlia Avenger, and more taunting letters followed. One even announced, "I will give myself up for 10 a.m. Jan 29th. Had my fun at police. Black Dahlia Avenger." But January 29 came and went. No one showed up. With every letter, the case grew more twisted. Was the killer playing a game? Was it a real confession or a hoax? One thing was certain. The hunt for the Black Dahlia's murderer was only just beginning. The brutality of Elizabeth Short's murder sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. The police were under immense pressure to catch the killer, but with no witnesses, no crime scene, and only taunting letters to go on, they were grasping at straws. Then came the tips and confessions, hundreds of them. More than 60 people would eventually confess to the murder. Some were attention seekers, others were mentally unstable, but none had real evidence linking them to the crime. Despite the chaos, the LAPD focused on a list of promising suspects, and at the top, Dr. George Hodel. Hodel was a wealthy and well-connected Hollywood physician, a man with dark secrets. He had been accused of sexually abusing his own daughter and was rumored to host bizarre, orgy-like parties at his lavish mansion. In the 1950s, his own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective, became convinced that his father had murdered Elizabeth Short. He presented chilling evidence, including a photo found in Hodel's belongings that resembled Elizabeth, and a recording of Hodel allegedly saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore, 'cause she's dead." But despite strong suspicions, Hodel was never charged. He later fled to Asia and lived out his life in exile. Mark Hansen was a Hollywood nightclub owner with close ties to Elizabeth Short. She had even stayed at his home. Her address book, mailed to the press by the killer, belonged to Hansen. Police questioned him extensively. Some believed he knew more than he admitted. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the murder, and he was never arrested. Then came Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and former mortician's assistant. He knew disturbing details about the crime before they were made public. He even named a friend as the killer, but detectives believed he was speaking about himself in third person. For a time, the LAPD was convinced he was the murderer, but when they tried to press charges, higher-ups mysteriously intervened. The case against Dillon collapsed. Did the police get too close to the truth, or did corruption play a role? Some believe powerful figures in Hollywood covered up the real killer's identity. More than 75 years have passed, and the Black Dahlia murder remains one of the most famous unsolved crimes in history. Over the decades, countless theories have emerged, some chillingly plausible, others pure speculation. But the deeper you look, the more unsettling the case becomes. Was this the work of a sadistic serial killer, a Hollywood cover-up, or something even darker? Elizabeth Short wasn't the only woman brutally murdered in Los Angeles during this time. Some believe her death was linked to a series of other unsolved cases, including the killings of Jeanne French in 1947 and the Cleveland torso murders in the 1930s. Could this have been the work of a lone sadistic killer, operating undetected across multiple states? Some profilers believe the precise dismemberment of Elizabeth's body suggests a killer with medical knowledge, perhaps a surgeon or a mortician. This theory brings us back to one name, Dr. George Hodel. Many believe the LAPD knew who the killer was, but covered it up. Why? Corruption ran deep in 1940s Los Angeles. The police were known to protect Hollywood elites, mobsters, and high-profile figures. When Leslie Dillon became a prime suspect, detectives were ready to make an arrest, but someone shut the investigation down. Could Dillon have had powerful connections? Was he working for someone higher up? Then there's Dr. George Hodel. His family home was bugged by police in 1950, and officers heard disturbing conversations, including Hodel admitting to murder. But instead of arresting him, he was allowed to flee to Asia. Did the LAPD let a killer walk free, or was someone even more powerful behind Elizabeth Short's murder? Some believe Elizabeth Short's murder was connected to the darker side of Hollywood. She was an aspiring actress, surrounded by powerful men. Could she have seen or known something she wasn't supposed to? One theory suggests she may have been lured into an underground Hollywood sex ring, where she met a violent end. Some claim her death was a ritualistic killing, orchestrated to send a message. The way her body was posed, the eerie smile carved into her face, it all seemed staged, deliberate. Could a Hollywood mogul, a powerful studio executive, or a wealthy sadist have been responsible? Elizabeth Short's life was brief, her death tragic. But her story, it became legend. Her murder was not just another crime, it became a cultural obsession, woven into the fabric of Hollywood, literature, and true crime lore. Over the decades, the Black Dahlia case has been reimagined, fictionalized, and mythologized. transforming Elizabeth from a real woman into a ghostly symbol of Hollywood's dark side. Almost immediately after her death, the case captivated Hollywood. Films and TV shows drew inspiration from her murder, blending fact with fiction. In 1947, just months after her death, films Born to Kill and The Blue Dahlia eerily mirrored aspects of the case, fueling speculation. James Ellroy's 1998 novel, The Black Dahlia, later turned into a 2006 film, turned Elizabeth's murder into a hard-boiled detective story. The Oscar-winning film L.A. Confidential, 1997, didn't name Elizabeth directly, but its storyline dripped with references to her case. Even American Horror Story paid homage, portraying a fictionalized version of Elizabeth Short's murder in its first season. Hollywood couldn't resist the Black Dahlia mystery. But in turning Elizabeth Short into a pop culture icon, did the real woman behind the legend get lost? As the decades passed, Elizabeth Short's story became something more than just an unsolved murder. It became an urban legend. Some claim her ghost still roams the streets of Los Angeles, particularly near the Biltmore Hotel where she was last seen alive. Visitors report seeing a woman in a black dress, only for her to vanish when they get too close. Paranormal investigators and ghost hunters have long theorized that the brutal nature of her death left a permanent mark on the city. Some believe she lingers as a restless spirit, forever searching for justice. But beyond the headlines, the horror, and the ghost stories, Elizabeth Short was a real person. She was a young woman with dreams, with struggles, with a life ahead of her. She had friends, family, and aspirations. She wanted to be a Hollywood star, not a murder victim. Yet in death, she became something else. Her story was sensationalized, twisted, and reshaped by the media until she was no longer Elizabeth Short, but the Black Dahlia. Would she have been remembered differently if her death hadn't been so shocking? Would she have lived a long life if she had never come to Los Angeles? We'll never know. But what we do know is this: Elizabeth Short didn't deserve to be remembered only as a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer. And even though her killer was never found, her story still haunts us today. Elizabeth Short's murder remains one of the most infamous cold cases in American history. Maybe one day new evidence will emerge. Maybe technology will finally unmask her killer. Or maybe the truth is already buried, lost in the whispers of Hollywood's darkest secrets. Who killed the Black Dahlia? Maybe we'll never know. But one thing is certain: her story will never be forgotten.